Good morning, everyone. I'm Jen Reitz. I'm with the University of Delaware's Institute for Public Administration, and I'm a member of the Mid-Atlantic TAB team, and TAB stands for Technical Assistance to Brownfields, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But with me today, Becca, who just spoke, and then Seth, who I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Seth Cardwell. I'm the Community Development Associate on the team at West Virginia University, which is one of the partners of Mid-Atlantic TAB. I'm based out of Morgantown, West Virginia. I've got a background in public administration. Jen will be doing most of the speaking today, so this is probably all you'll hear from me.
He's here for moral support for us all. All right. So next slide. Okay. So at Mid-Atlantic TAB, what do? We are here, as I said, is in our name, is to provide technical assistance to kind of meet communities where they are in terms of their brownfield needs. And sometimes that's basic 101, like what is a brownfield? And sometimes that's something a little more technical, like today's webinar on the grants and that are available through the EPA. And so we offer a lot of brownfield education. Okay. And the main focus for today will be our EPA and our DNREC friends, our partners. So I'm going to let the EPA introduce themselves. Dawn?
I was going to let Tony start since he's in the
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I was muted there for a sec. Hi, I'm Tony Geiger. I'm a project officer with EPA Region 3 Brownfields Program. Also our state liaison to DNREC and the Delaware Brownfields Program. And I'll kick it over to Dawn.
And I'm Dawn Farver. I'm also a project officer in EPA Region 3 and provide support for Tony for Delaware.
And then our DNREC friends.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Leckie, and I'm a Planner 5 here at DNREC. I manage the Brownfield program. Thank you.
Great. Okay. No Sandra today. So next slide.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Here you are.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi. So Sandra Wilson, planner for DNREC. I support Melissa. And I just noticed that my section says reclamation section on the slide. So you can find me in the reclamation section.
Okay, great. I do want to say that today's webinar, again, gets a little more into the nitty-gritty of this year's FY25's grants. And so if you're looking for something a little more broadly addressing the different grants that are available through the EPA for brownfields, I'm going to refer you back to a webinar we did back in August, so part 1. And this is really more of that broad dive into each of the grant types and the narratives and meeting requirements, those types of things. And so even if you just need a refresher, you were there. The link when you receive these slides will be live and we can refer you back to that webinar. But today we'll be diving a little more deeply into this year's grant sequence. So, and with that, we're going to be talking about, again, the different grants and their eligibility. We're talking a little bit about SAM.gov, which is really the very, very first step that everybody needs to take care of when they leave today's webinar. Some of the grant changes and the actual grant packages that they'll have today, some key information, and then other resources. But I'm going to turn it over to our friends at the EPA.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to get us started talking about the grant overview. These are usually referred to as MARC grants, although just to note that this year, the multi-purpose grants are not included in this round of applications. So MARC is multi-purpose assessment, revolving loan funds, and cleanup grants. With regard to timeline, applications this year are due on November 14th. Following receipt of all applications and the closing of the deadline, the threshold eligibility review will take place. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means a little bit later in the presentation, but we first do a high-level review just to make sure all applications that have been submitted are eligible for funding. Following that, there is a national review process where panels of EPA people and other federal partners will review all of the applications and score them accordingly. This can take a little bit of time. We all meet in person to talk through all the applications. And then following that scoring process, The applications will then go to the headquarters for a final review and selection in April, and then following that final review and selection, the selection announcements come out in May. This is a table that talks about the anticipated grants and funding that will be offered for fiscal year 2025. These are not official. These are what we anticipate. So these should probably be pretty close to what will happen, but we're not 100% sure. There are a couple of things I want to make sure you know on this table. Excuse me. So you can see what the grant type is on the far left, the maximum project period, the maximum amount per grant, and the estimated number of awards. So as you're looking to apply, you can see that, for example, for assessment coalition grants, which is the second one down, the maximum project period is 4 years, maximum amount per grant is $1,200,000, and the number of awards is 29. So that can change depending on the award type. Also on the far right, there are some notes for you to review to understand whether or not you would qualify for as a new grantee or an existing grantee related to the community-wide assessment grants. So take a look at that if you're not sure. After a certain date, if you haven't had a grant, you can still qualify as a new grantee, even if you've had a grant before. And finally, if you look at the cleanup grants at the bottom, when you apply for a cleanup grant, it's important to note how much funding that you think you will need. If you see the top cleanup grant, the maximum amount per grant is $500,000, but there are a few more awards that will possibly be available at that price point. So keep that in mind as you're planning for your cleanup grant. Regarding eligibility, one of the best things to do is take a look at that link below, but you're eligible if you are a state, local, or tribal government, if you are a general purpose unit of local government, regional council or redevelopment agency sanctioned by the state, nonprofit organization, or a quasi-governmental organization. One important thing to note with regard to nonprofit organizations is 501c4 organizations can be eligible to apply for a grant as long as they do not actually lobby as part of their activities. So if you do political lobbying and you're a 501c4, you do not qualify, you're not eligible. If you are a 501c4, you will have to fill out a form just to confirm that you do not participate in lobbying activities, and then you can still be eligible for grants. Okay, so these charts are really, really helpful. If you already have an existing grant, this will be really good for you. If you do not, you can kind of ignore this part. But if you already have a grant, if you look in that column on the left-hand side, you can see what type of grant that you may have, and then whether or not you can actually apply for another grant in fiscal year 2025. So different types of grants, you may have the opportunity to do that even if you have an existing grant. A couple important things to note, all of those yellow boxes, is that if you have one of those grants on the left-hand side and you want to apply for a grant and you follow in that yellow box, that you must draw down 70% of that grant that you already have before October 1st of this year. So that would have had to already happen. So that's an important thing to note as you're looking at grants to apply for. Also, we have an eligibility chart for multiple applications. So you can apply for multiple grants within the same cycle, again, following some of these rules. So look and see what you're interested in and look and see if you qualify for those. But that is an option for you if you have multiple opportunities that you want to pursue. Oh, and then discussion on SAM.gov. So I'm going to pass this back over.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dawn. Okay, so SAM.gov, as I said, is one of the very first things that if you decide you want to go after a grant, and when you leave today's webinar, you should go look at. And so SAM.gov is the website where you create what is called a unique entity identifier, and UEI. Hard letters don't flow, but and it basically is the systems award management website. You have several things here that you need in order to register, and your organization, if you've applied for federal grants before, may already have one, but it's still important to double check who is registered because it might be a different name, it might be a different email address, and so it's really important to go in and check that for accuracy, as well as the entity as it's listed. You can make changes, and we recommend that you do that as soon as possible because it's not a last minute task. It's something that takes some time for them to update that information within the system. So next slide. Okay, and so the notice of funding opportunities are released through grants.gov. And when you submit the grant application also through grants.gov, it will require that you have that UEI that is produced from sam.gov. And so again, come November 14th, when these grants are due, you'll need to have that UEI. And so we just strongly encourage to go in now and check that and make sure the name and the email and phone numbers associated with those names are accurate, and somebody that can very quickly access that information and respond if there's a two-factor identification or something like that. And so when you do register, what you need are your tax ID number, your bank routing number or bank account number, as well as there is an option for mailing, but non-federal entities have to mail in certain forms. So, but again, the sam.gov, in addition to just needing it to be updated, it has to be renewed every year. And so every 12 months, because it is for the awards notification as well. And so if you're receiving the grants, that has to be active, starting when you're applying and then through the actual awards. Again, making sure that contact information is up to date. We at TAB can help you do this. You don't need to necessarily, if you have a consultant or have others that can help you with it, you can also reach out to us as kind of your first line of defense. We're not experts in it, but we can certainly help you through that process and answer any questions or find out the answers to questions along the way. All right, and back to Dawn.
Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about those threshold criteria we discussed earlier within that timeline. So this is the first part of what we will be reviewing for all grants to make sure that each grant application is eligible for the grant it's applying for. So related to all grants, this ensures that the applicants are eligible, as we've discussed. All the criteria are pass, fail, and based on requests for information that we'll talk about a little bit more in the further slides. So once only the applications that actually pass all of the threshold criteria will be moved on in the process. So that can shorten our list a little bit for our more detailed reviews. And you want to make sure that you really, really check your work and make sure everything's in there correct. Because once the application has been submitted, we cannot make changes to your application if you find errors afterwards. Another important note is that if for some reason your application is deemed ineligible because you do not meet the threshold criteria, you will be notified within 15 calendar days of that ineligibility determination. Okay, so getting a little bit more specific related to assessment grants and cleanup grants. For both of these grants, you'll need a current letter from the environmental state agency of where your project is located, acknowledging that you plan to conduct either an assessment or a cleanup. You have to get a new version of this letter each year. So for example, if you submitted an application the previous year and maybe you didn't quite get it selected, you can't use that same letter for the next year. You have to get a brand new letter from the state agencies. There's a little bit different information the state agencies will provide in that letter for an assessment grant versus a cleanup grant. As you see on the right-hand side, there's a little bit more information. You must show that there's been a sufficient level of site characterization from an environmental site assessment performed to date for remediation to begin on the site. So that will need to be provided to the state, and that's what they're acknowledging. So for example, a phase 2 environmental site assessment must be completed or an equivalent type of assessment. If you're applying for multiple types of grants, you only need one version of the letter, but you need to make sure you're making it clear to the state if it's an assessment grant or a cleanup grant, provide them any information they may need. And you want to make sure you get it to them in a timely manner, not like the day before you're sending in your application. You want to make sure they have a little time to review and get back to you with that letter, and they can talk a little bit more about what works for them in terms of that timing in later slides. Final note, you have to have a copy of that letter with each of your applications. So if you're putting in an assessment grant as well as a cleanup grant application and they have the same letter, you need to make sure that letter is still attached to both of those applications. Related more specifically to cleanup grants, ownership eligibility is a really important part of the threshold criteria. So the entity applying must be the sole owner of the site by the time the application is submitted. So this can be through a very simple legal document, but you need to include that information with your application. The owner must have also conducted all appropriate inquiries, or AAI, prior to acquiring the property. So a phase 1 environmental site assessment has to have been done not more than 180 days before the property transfer. And that helps to make sure that that owner is not liable for any contamination that exists at that site. Okay, also for cleanup grants, an important part of this is the community notification and public meeting portion. So in the public meeting, you'll be discussing a draft application, considering what public comments you receive, responding to those public comments. This public meeting can either be a regularly scheduled community meeting with other topics, or it can be part of a regularly scheduled meeting. So you don't have to have a separate meeting scheduled just to discuss the grant application. You can do it as part of a public meeting, contact them and add it to the agenda. Generally, in-person meetings are the ones held, but you can also have a virtual meeting and that will meet the criteria. For your grant application related to your public meeting, you have to attach comments or a summary of the public comments received, responses that you had to those public comments, and then meeting notes or a summary of the public meetings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that within the community notification part. That public meeting does have to happen before your application goes in, or you're not going to have that information that's required to be attached. Okay, related to community notification, you also have to have an ad in a local newspaper or an equivalent means to communicate with your community. That has to happen no later than 2 weeks before the application is submitted. And so that has to happen 2 weeks before your application is submitted, not 2 weeks before the deadline for the applications. So if you submit your application on November 1st, you have to have that meeting, or that notification has to happen at least 2 weeks before you submit your application. In the community notifications, there are requirements of what that needs to state. You need to be able to tell people where a copy of the grant application is, including the draft ABCA, that this is available for public review and comment, how they can comment on the draft application if the community has any comments, where the draft is being housed, whether you have a copy at the town hall for them to review, a library, or there's a website where they can access it, and then also the date, time, and location of the public meeting that they can come to if they want to provide comments in person. Okay, so this is a really, really cool infographic that TAB has done for us that builds on the narrative that's already provided on what you need to include. So this doesn't supersede that, but it helps you kind of follow some of the tracking. It discusses things like your property ownership eligibility, some of the exemptions for that are important to note if you're the owner of the property, as well as, for example, on the right-hand side, if the property ownership eligibility related to petroleum sites, which can be a little bit different. There is a link here for the full handout, which I would recommend looking at and going through, and that can help get some of your questions answered. And then related to the assessment grant, they also have information related to the threshold criteria for the assessment grants, which can be a little bit different. And so it talks about applicant eligibility, what community involvement is required for assessment grants, contractors and named subrecipients, and expenditure of existing grant funds if you already have a grant in the program. So again, check out the handout. It's very helpful. These were just some excerpts related to cleanup grants and assessment grants. And now I'm passing over to Tony to talk about the fiscal year 2025 grants changes. Tony, you're on mute. I don't know if you...
Thank you. Knew I was going to do that. Thanks, Dawn. So yeah, every year there are some changes in the competition. So it's important to note, especially if you're a past applicant, you know, you don't want to do any sort of assumptions or copy paste work from previous applications. You always want to check in case some of the guidelines have changed. So there is a complete list of changes that you can find. I highly recommend checking that out. You know, there's some things that I'm going to point out here, but then there's also just kind of smaller changes to the narrative criteria and rewording and everything. So the document at this link captures all of that in one place. Definitely worth checking out. So I'm highlighting a few changes for each grant type. We'll start with assessment grants. The major changes with our assessment coalition grants. So previously a non-lead coalition member would not be able to have had a MARC grant that closed in the past 7 years. So currently a non-lead member must never have been awarded a grant in the past 7 years or ever at any point. And that only has to be one of the non-lead members. If an entity does have an open MARC grant, they're still eligible to be a non-lead member, but they must have drawn down at least 70% of their funding. So that goes back to the eligibility chart that Dawn shared earlier. If you weren't sure, you can always check that chart. And assessment coalition applicants are no longer required to include a community-based nonprofit organization as a non-lead member. You can still include that type of organization, but it's not a requirement in order to receive the more favorable evaluation. Next, we'll look at one of the changes in cleanup grants. So we are now allowing site owners to attest if their site contains a structure that may have hazardous materials. If the site owner can attest that no materials have been released to the environment and they have not contributed to any further contamination, then they may still be granted protection from CERCLA liability, and that site may still be eligible for a cleanup grant. And then looking at revolving loan funds next. These grants, basically, since they can be a combination of assessment work, cleanup work, other types of work, really all the changes that would apply to assessment or cleanup grants now apply to RLF grants as well. So rather going through those again, I would recommend definitely just going through the RLF guidelines very closely, and again, checking that summary sheet of all the changes for the criteria this year. So any questions on threshold, competition changes for the year?
There are no questions currently in the chat, but we'll keep monitoring. So feel free to type if you're still typing, and we'll get to your questions anytime.
And I did want to note real quick, Becca, since we did talk about threshold, if there is a section of threshold criteria that is not applicable to your organization, don't just leave that part of the threshold out. It's better to include your header and write not applicable underneath of it. You can provide a brief statement as to why. That's great, but at least write not applicable so we're not guessing, trying to have to reach out again for those answers. Okay. So I guess we're going to hand it off to DNREC next to talk about the grant package.
Yes, thank you. Go to the next slide. So first we're going to talk about the narrative information sheet. You will need to provide your applicant identification, which is your name and full address, a website URL if you have one, the funding requested, the grant type, and the amount, and the location. Now, for certain types of grants, you also need to provide the targeted area and priority site information, which is for site-specific assessments and cleanups, the contact, population of your jurisdiction or the targeted area, and some other things you're going to need are the letter from our agency acknowledging the plan to conduct the assessment and releasing the copies of the applications on the EPA website. So for all the narratives must be single spaced. Nothing can exceed the page limit, or those won't be reviewed, the additional pages. So for the cleanup assessment grant, they're 10-page limit. And for the RLF grant, it's a 12-page limit. The narrative will include responses to the ranking criteria, must provide sufficient detail to allow for an evaluation of the merits of the application, and the different categories are project description and plan for revitalization, community need and community engagement, task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress, and then programmatic capability and past performance. There'll be threshold criteria responses and other factors and considerations. And just a note that the EPA evaluates the information that is required on the notice of funding opportunity. So to that end, they don't encourage solicitation of support letters from members of Congress as it's not needed. So for our letters from the state, we'll discuss next. To be eligible for one of the EPA grants, you would have to qualify for our Brownfield program. So to be eligible for the Brownfield program, the applicant must affirmatively demonstrate they did not cause or contribute to the release. The applicant must be in full compliance with all environmental requirements in Delaware. They must not be a chronic violator, and they must not be in any current enforcement action with a state or federal environmental agency. Now, to not be eligible for the Brownfields program, it's just pretty much the opposite of what I just said. The applicant is a responsible party. The applicant is not in compliance with all environmental requirements in Delaware. They're a chronic violator, or they're currently in an enforcement action with a state or federal environmental agency. So for requesting the letter, if you have any assessment results, you must submit them. The state letter must affirm eligibility for the site to be entered into the Delaware Brownfield program. The letter must also affirm that the site has a sufficient level of site characterization to begin remediation, or will have a sufficient level by summer 2025. For sites not eligible for the Brownfield program, an environmental professional must certify that a sufficient level of site characterization has been performed in order to begin the remediation. And just submit the request as soon as possible to review the assessment data. So the required attachment for all, the letter from DNREC is required attachment for all grants. It acknowledges our awareness and support of the project, site characteristic levels from the environmental site assessment. One letter can be used for multiple applications. The letter must be the current year. And for this letter, you want to contact me here at DNREC. My contact information is listed. And you should include the grant you're applying for, the location, and the plan for the site and project. And if you could submit that to me before at least 2 weeks prior to the deadline of November 15th, that would be ideal. So thank you.
Okay, great. So let's talk a little bit about key information. Okay, so all of the federal forms are listed here in terms, and Becca has just put all of the links that we've referred to throughout this presentation has been put in the chat, which is really, really wonderful. Thank you, Becca. And so we have files here and sample forms that are on the EPA website, and links that, again, Becca just put in the chat that can help you to fill out some of those forms. And then all of those attachments, the different attachments, are required to be put into one file when you submit for the grant. So next slide. If you were applied previously and were unsuccessful, please refer back to your grant debrief, or, again, this is ways of strengthening the grant as you move forward. And again, as some of those criteria change from year to year, is a way of building in some of those previous feedback. Next slide. There's also yes, of course. The FAQs is something that is always on the website, and it's kind of a first line of defense, first place to go to check, because they are collecting those questions that we continually get and are addressed on the website. And again, have been put into the chat. And so you can refer back to those first. And if you still have questions, then obviously feel free. Tab is here to help with that, as well as your EPA leads and project officers. Next. So again, any questions? It's a lot of information that has been thrown at you over the past half hour. A lot of tables and smaller graphics, but again, we're trying to kind of work together to make it as easy to navigate that process as possible. And that's why we're here and kind of doing the individual state webinars and creating kind of those infographics and worksheets to kind of help you get through that.
And as Becca said in the chat at the beginning, all of these slides will be provided. So some of the figures I went through that you might want to go through in more detail, you'll be able to see in the slides as well. So that should be helpful to you after our meeting's over today.
Absolutely.
And since we do not currently have any questions in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll. So one of our requirements as the tab provider for the region is to kind of report on different metrics. So you should have a poll popping up on your Zoom screen. If you've got the latest version, if you could answer at least the first question, that would help us out very much. So it's, how prepared do you feel to write an EPA Brownfields Grant application after receiving support and resources? And then the second question is optional. What other topics or activities would you like to see included in future tab events? I'm going to let that run for a couple minutes and we can go to our next section.
And that is, as we are here right now, that is the Mid-Atlantic tab is here to help. So in addition to the Brownfields education and webinars like we're doing here today, TAB also offers a variety of resources throughout the application process, as well as once you become once you receive an award. Some of that includes resource roadmaps, which is when you have a project and there are a variety of sources, funding sources that could be used to fund that moving forward. We can help you work with a consultant and find and kind of map out what those potential funding sources are for different pieces of your puzzle, because we know these Brownfields grants projects can be a long-term project, and that there's multiple sources and ways of of getting them done and keeping them moving along. And so we also provide grant review. And so the Mid-Atlantic tab can review your grant before and provide some feedback before you submit it to the EPA. We do ask to have a couple of weeks before of time to be able to do that and get to that proper feedback. There's grant writing assistance. Actually, for local governments in Delaware, there is another program at UD that can actually help do grant writing. It's separate from TAB, but you can feel free to reach out and ask about that. We also do Brownfield program support in terms of creating inventories and training to do local inventories, technical support, site design assistance. We do have design centers that are associated with our partners and can help you do with that visualization part, the community engagement piece, each of the steps along the way. And if we can't help, we will find somebody. We find somebody who can. So there's a lot of different areas where we can be of assistance, and just have to ask. Next slide. So important deadlines as we move forward. Again, if you do want TAB to review your grant, we asked, and it's due November 14th, but we do ask that by November 1st, you submit the draft grant to us for that feedback. Also, that November 1st deadline, which is coming up in just about 10 days or so, is the same deadline to get DNREC your request and the information that they're requesting in order to provide that state letter, because they need, again, time to review the information that you've submitted and to get that letter turned around back to you. And it's usually that little burst of activity right before the grant's due. And so we want to make sure they have time to do that. All right, and here, when you get the slides, so you'll have all of our information on the slides. You can feel free to reach out, stay connected. Again, these slides will be sent out to everyone who registered for the webinar beforehand. And so you can reach out directly to Tab, and there's online scheduling, so it couldn't be easier, as well as all of our social media links and websites. So I want to thank everybody for coming here and kind of, one last call for questions while you've got us all online.
Still nothing in the chat. DNREC, EPA, are there any final thoughts or advice you want to give?
Just thanks everyone for coming out to this and sitting in. I hope that some of you are working on applications now or are planning to. We're looking forward to seeing what comes in.
Yes, and I'll just, reiterate what Tony says. Hopefully we have some good candidates for some grants this year. And if not, hopefully they'll still get you motivated to apply for next year. So thank you.
And I just want to add one thing, like this is grant season, right? Now through November, and for EPA, it extends through the process, but Tab is here all year. And so whenever those questions pop up, maybe you don't feel ready for this cycle, but you want to start thinking about next year. We're here and we're ready to meet you wherever you are.